In this session, we want to talk about Windows Deployment Services. Windows Deployment Services is a role on Windows Server 2012 R2 that can be installed. The purpose of this role is the deployment of multiple images or operating systems on client machines. There are some requirements for the deployment of images or operating systems when you're using Windows Deployment Services. And as we actually install the role, we're going to go through the requirements that you will need for the server. On the client side, the client must be configured to boot from the network card, which means that you need to go into the BIOS of the computer and you need to configure the computer to boot from the network card for its first boot option. The deployment process involves the server being configured with the image that is needed or just an operating system. And then the client itself, when the client is turned on, the client will automatically search for the Wds server on the network. Once that client computer is configured to boot from the network card, then the client will automatically be connected to the Wds server. And what will show on the client screen would be the images that were prepared on the server. The user can click on the image that he or she wants. And if you have configured an answer file, then there would be no interaction at all with the image. If you haven't configured an answer file, then you probably will be asked to partition the disk the way you want it to be. And once you have done that, then the image will begin processing and it will actually come down to the client's computer. We're going to take a look at the installation of the role itself. To install the WDS role, on the Server Manager dashboard, we're going to click on Manage, Add Roles and Features. We want to click Next on the Before You Begin screen. And we want to click Next on the Installation type. And we're going to be installing the role on the only server that we have here. So we're going to click Next on the Destination Server screen. And we want to scroll down a bit. So we're going to just click here on the down arrow until we see Windows Deployment Services. There it is, Windows Deployment Services. We want to click on Windows Deployment Services. And then we want to click on Add Features. Before we move on, let us look at the description on the right-hand side. Description says, Windows Deployment Services provides a simplified, secure means of rapidly and remotely deploying Windows operating systems to computers over the network. So you're not going to want to use Windows Deployment Services if you're just deploying the operating system to one computer. If you have a number of computers, you want the operating system to be deployed simultaneously on all those systems, then your answer is Windows Deployment Services. We want to click on Next to continue. On the feature page, we're going to click Next again. And we're going to pause here at the WDS page. because this page has a lot of information that we need to know. It has the requirements for using WDS, and on this page you're going to find a lot of exam questions. The first part of the page speaks to the RIS, which is the former system that Microsoft used to deploy images. Microsoft now uses WDS. The things that you will need to note. If you're going to be using WDS, then you're going to want to have an Active Directory domain controller. You need to have a DHCP server, because the DHCP server will give out addresses, and that's how your client computer will be able to find the WDS server. You also need DNS on the network. When you are installing the role, you will see that one of the things that you install is the transport server. So you need both the WDS and the transport server. And both of these services requires an NTFS partition for file store. What does that mean? Our images that we create, we need to store those images probably on a separate partition other than the operating system partition. And the partition that we store the images on has to be formatted with NTFS. You can install WDS as we're doing from the interface, or you can use a command line utility called wdsutil.exe. After the installation of WDS, you need to do two things. One, you need to add a boot image, and you need to add an install image. And you will see us do that. If you have a Server 2012, a copy of Server 2012, or any other operating system, you will find the install file and the boot file in the sources folder of your software. Remember also that the client computer must be configured to be PXE enabled. That simply means it must be configured to boot from the network card. We're going to go ahead and click Next to continue. And here we see we have the deployment server, and we also have the transport server. And both of those are ticked off. We're going to click Next to continue. You want to review the items that you're installing on your confirmation page, and then you want to click on Install to begin the installation. So that's how we configure the role. That's how we install the role. And remember that the very next thing that we have to do is that once the role is installed, we have to actually configure the server. So that's going to be our next task, configuring the WDS server. And our first steps again, we want to install a boot file, and we want to install an install file. So that's install.wim and boot.wim, and we find those files within the sources folder of your operating system software. This is the end of the WDS install session, and I want to thank you for listening.